is a political editor at the Daily Mirror. I keep wanting to promote you to editor, Pippa, for some reason. Suzanne Evans, Suzanne Evans, it's only a matter of time, isn't it? Suzanne Evans is here too, political commentator and all things Brexit, or at least used to be, but who knows. Francis O'Grady is here as well, the General Secretary of the TUC. Now, if you'd like to send your questions through, you can do so on text 84850, or you can phone, that's what we prefer, 0345 6060 973. And, of course, you can watch us on Global Player.
Call 0345 6060 973. Tweet at LBC. Text 84850. Cross question with Iain Dale. This is LBC.
Well, let's go to our first caller. It's Ben in Clacton. Hello, Ben.
Hello, Ian, and good evening, panel. My question is, since the government have been found guilty of the policy was breaking the law of sending care home residents out of hospital into care homes, should the relatives of the loved ones that were lost consider suing the government for compensation?
Well, seeing as you're in Clacton, Ben, we'll go from one Essex boy to another, and I don't mean me, Simon Heffer.
I bet there's a lawyer out there somewhere who's already drawing up the class action. It does sound really quite appalling, and it raises again the question of the so-called inquiry that we're going to have into COVID, for which we have been waiting now for quite a long time. I think it would have been very sensible for the government to have instituted this inquiry when the pandemic was still going. And one does get the sense the can is being kicked down the road, because every day there are more and more iniquities. I mean, this is a terrible one. Obviously, people have died. But when one thinks of the story this morning about the people taking suitcases loads of money out of the country because of the fraudulent way that people behaved with the compensation scheme under COVID, there is so much that went wrong. And look, people understand we hadn't had a pandemic since 1918. We'd never had a pandemic where the government had decided to close the country down. That's something an inquiry must discuss, whether that was a good idea or not. I'm not saying that the inquiry should just be there to apportion blame, but we might get another pandemic in 5 years' time, for all we know, and we need to have the best possible plan to deal with it. And it's quite clear that a lot of very grave mistakes were made that in this case affected human life, in other cases affected vast amounts of taxpayers' money that could have been so much better spent or not spent at all. And so to me, what's happened today with this care home story is another reason to get this public inquiry underway as quickly as possible.
I thought it was supposed to be starting in the spring, and we are in the spring, so you would expect it to start imminently.
Did they say which spring?
Francis?
Well, the government promised that they were going to put a protective ring around care homes, and clearly they didn't, and that was a lie. And it wasn't just releasing patients untested into care homes, and that leading to a wildfire of infections, not only in terms of residents but staff too. It was the lack of PPE, it was the lack of sick pay, proper sick pay, and so many carers, social carers on 0 hours contracts, no sick pay, going from home to home, unwittingly spreading the virus. So the inquiry is going to be really important, but I mean, I know that the daughters who brought the case believe that the Prime Minister should resign, and I think most people now feel, the guy who set the laws, broke the laws, lied about it, he should go. So I don't know about suing the government, but I think it's probably time they were sent packing.
Suzanne Evans, the accusation is that the government saw what was happening in the hospitals in Italy and thought we can't have these scenes on our television screens in this country, so we've got to get a lot of old people out of the hospitals so they have the capacity to cope with COVID patients, and then didn't even test them before they got sent out. I mean, I had a caller earlier in the programme who said this is criminal negligence.
I think it's worse than that, isn't it, Ian? Actually, not only did they not protect those elderly people, they lied about it. Of course, the health secretary responsible for this has resigned, and he has gone, Matt Hancock. And I clearly remember him saying...
nothing to do with him, Gov, today.
He was the one that actually said, we are testing, we are not sending people out of hospital into care homes with COVID. He absolutely categorically denied that was happening. And it was happening. And my overriding feeling about this is that, are we really a country that throws our elderly people to the walls? Because that's what it looks like. It was like the elderly don't care, don't matter, they're in care homes, they're near the end of their life anyway. And what really bugs me is that we still don't seem to care. We still have a situation because of the ongoing COVID paranoia. You know, we've got to learn to live with COVID now, but we still have, and I have friends and family in care homes. You're still not allowed to visit properly. There are still rules and regulations. Care home residents with dementia don't understand what's going on. I've heard dreadful stories, both in a friend of mine in a care home who sadly recently died, but other family and friends who are really struggling and feel their loved ones feel that they've been totally let down. The situation is absolutely appalling. We've spoken about this, Iain, before. I think the way in which the government handled the whole pandemic, throwing out long-established pandemic plans in favour of the Chinese lockdown model, was a massive mistake. We will be paying for the consequences for a very long time. And as Simon says, that inquiry can't come soon enough. We have to make sure this never happens again. And rather than anyone sue the government, because at the end of the day, it's only the taxpayer that ends up paying for that. It's you and me and all of us around this table who are paying taxes. They're the only people we're the only people that lose out. What I want is an assurance from government this will never happen again. And I think it should be set and sealed in legislation that we have no more lockdowns, that we never again have these knee-jerk reactions.
Slightly straying off the subject there, but I suspect one or two of our panellists might disagree with you on that. But let's stick to the question for the moment. Pippa Crerar.
Well, Downing Street said earlier today that it was a possibility that further legal claims could follow as a result of this High Court judgment, but that obviously it was up to the families and the care homes. And I think some of the lawyers already have suggested that some compensation potentially could be paid out. That obviously is up to the families. I spent the last 2 years talking to families who have had loved ones in care homes. Many of them lost their relatives, and almost overwhelmingly their desire is what they regard as justice. And that justice doesn't entail a payout by the taxpayer or anybody else. It entails accountability. And this judgment today in the High Court, I think, was an important step towards that. The Prime Minister apologised again, but at the same time as apologising on the one hand, on the other, he says, we've got all the big calls right. Well, you know what? This was a big call. 20,000 people died in British care homes between March and June 2020. That was not all because of seeding from hospital infections, of course, but many of them will have caught COVID as a result of patients being discharged. And while Matt Hancock may get into the wranglings as what he knew and when, we know that Sage Papers in January said that this was quite likely. And we know that in March, Patrick Vallance, the chief scientist, warned the government too. And while it may be the case that the court has declared that there was no evidence that Matt Hancock considered quarantine, they also said there was no evidence that he was asked to consider quarantine by his officials. Ultimately, it was for ministers to be on top of their brief on this. And nobody's saying that this wasn't an incredibly difficult situation.
He would no doubt say, and he has said in his statement today, look, Public Health England did not warn me about sort of the asymptomatic issue.
Didn't he read
Sage
Papers?
Well, yes, but Sage, I said earlier, and probably a lot of people didn't like it when I said this, Sage got a lot of things wrong in this pandemic. Yeah. So in the end, if you're a government minister, none of us have been government ministers, you assimilate all the evidence and then you make a decision. Now, we can sit here and pontificate about how he got all these decisions wrong, but in the end, that's what ministers have to do. Advisors advise, ministers decide.
But Iain, there were a number of occasions during the worst days of the pandemic when and I'm sure I wasn't alone in this, sat down and watched the news on television because I wasn't out partying, I had nothing to do but watch television, and thought to myself, don't they have a brain? Can't they work out? I mean, it's pretty obvious.
Not the first time you thought that, to be fair.
It's not the first time I thought it, but if you've got people going, from care homes and spreading disease in this way, it's a question of common sense. You don't actually need to read a Sage paper. You just need to engage your brain. And, I mean, Suzanne is right that suing people actually achieves nothing. You can't bring these people back to life, unfortunately. And in any case, what good is the money going to do other than denude the taxpayer of funds that could go to something, for the future rather than for the past? But perhaps when we've had an inquiry, we need to consider something which we taught the Americans, and we've failed to learn from the Americans, which is we need to have a system of impeachment. I think if the inquiry finds that one or two very senior ministers have behaved in a derelict, negligent way, they should be made to answer for it. And if there isn't a law on the statute book to do it, then Parliament still has the right to impeach somebody. It hasn't done so since 1806. But I think a national emergency and crisis of the sort we've just lived through is a golden opportunity to resurrect this, because people will be unhappy and will be aggrieved permanently if they feel that justice has not been done on this front. And clearly, the relatives of the bereaved relatives have suffered a massive injustice here, and somebody has to be brought to account for it.
Would anyone ever want to be a Secretary of State for Health if they stood the risk of impeachment?
Well, I mean, why not?
Or any other cabinet?
Look, I don't want to be funny about this, but he did seem to spend a lot of his time, with his tongue down the throat of his special advisor. And perhaps if he'd had a bit more regard for the job rather than, Mrs. What's-her-name, things might have been slightly different.
You can't accuse Matt Hancock of not being on the job, Simon.
Well, yes, indeed, but it depends what job you're on, dear boy. And this is the trouble. He gave the impression of lecturing us and yet not taking the job seriously. But I'm not saying necessarily he's the one you impeach. Maybe you impeach the Prime Minister at the end of it.
Isn't it about who you listen to as well? Advisors are important, but as well as the families who were really making their voices heard about concerns they had about care homes, staff were. Remember, right back at the beginning, staff didn't have the most basic protective equipment. There were problems about getting tests. And as Simon says, I agree. I mean, how much advice do you need on some of these basics? If it doesn't feel safe, if staff are telling you that they're not getting the basic resources they need, how safe is it just to
we
push
had a
people into those
discussion
homes?
in the last hour about sort of middle-ranking staff making the decisions because they were presumably getting diktats from the Department of Health, Public Health, I don't know who, but someone was saying, you need to do this. And it wasn't just in one NHS trust. This was all over the country. I think it was in Scotland as well that this was happening. Not sure about Wales. But there was clearly a national strategy to do this. Now, you have to be a pretty brave middle manager to say, I'm sorry, this is unethical. I'm not going to do it.
Well, isn't that why we elect our politicians? We elect brave people who are going to make decisions. And
was it a politician's decision, or was it somebody at the top of the NHS structure?
But what message is being sent from the top when reportedly we heard the Prime Minister thought that older people's lives, frankly, were more dispensable? That, pile them high. They've already had a good life. He denies
saying that.
He denies it, but enough people have said that's what was said.
Dominic Cummings said it was said.
And
I think one of the problems that we've got in modern day politics is that ministers are relying far too much on quangos to tell them what to do. And I think that is a massive failing. The old days, sorry to sound a bit archaic here, but, the buck did stop with the minister. We had a much smaller cabinet, we had a much smaller accountable team. We didn't have this ability to be able to farm out decision-making to quangos and then pass the buck and deny our responsibility. That's something I'd very much like to see.
And people would resign if they got it wrong.
Absolutely, too, yeah.
Well, John Major's fault then.
Potentially, yes.
I mean,
John Major's responsible for a lot of things.
Well, he was the one that brought in a lot of these agencies.
He did, and of course, every government since, in my living memory anyway, has gone on to put in their manifesto that they're going to have a bonfire of the quangos, and it never happens because, of course, once they get into power, they realise how important quangos are in terms of being able to. It's deniable responsibility.
Well, also they're the experts often. I mean, you talk about quangos as those sort of people on the take.
Well,
desperate to just sort of come up with, spend taxpayer money and so on. But I mean, what, are you talking about bodies like, I don't know, health and safety bodies or
highways? National highways they're called now. Their only remit in life is to stop me getting to Norfolk on a Friday night, and they're very successful at it. But don't get me started on that. We'll move on.
Okay, we can scrap them.
Ben in Clacton, a final word from you.
Well, I would suggest that the panel read the Amnesty International report on care homes, which was published in 2021. You can Google it. And that will tell you a lot more facts than I can actually say. And I warned on the radio in March 2020. I warned the BBC, I warned the LBC, Radio London, ITV, wrote to MPs, because I was a carer at the time. And I had one client in a care home and 6 in the neighbourhood. And I asked for a test in 111, and they said, you can't have it because we're only giving it to hospital staff. I had to resign because I didn't want to kill my clients. I knew exactly what was going to happen with care staff as well, going around homes, and myself. I didn't want that on my conscience to actually be going around killing people. Who I loved the job, and I had to give it up because
listen to the front line, Ben. That's
absolutely,
the
Ben. Listen, thank you very much for calling in on this. We'll come to more of your calls in a moment. 0345 6060 973. It's 17 minutes past 8.
LBC. Cross Question with Iain Dale on LBC.
Never buy one.
90 minutes past 8. Simon Heffer is here, Pippa Crerar, Suzanne Evans and Francis O'Grady. Pippa, do you want to explain to our listeners what you and I were doing yesterday?
Well, we were baking.
We were. First time for 20 years in my case.
Yes, and I have to say you did a really good job.
No, I didn't. I really didn't.
We were baking a Jewish bread called challah, which was at an event organised by the chief rabbi to promote...
And Jewish news.
To promote the Shabbat, which is basically...
Obviously didn't do a very good job with you.
Friday nights, families turning off technology for 24 hours and spending time together and focusing on the things which really matter. And in our case, what really mattered was baking this bread. And we had journalists versus politicians, and we were up against Sajid Javid, the Health Secretary, and Angie Rayner, the Deputy Leader of the Labour Party. Now, we can't tell you who won.
No.
But
we're sworn to secrecy.
Some of the breads that came out of the oven were a little bit more burnt than others.
Yes.
That's all we'll say.
Yes.
How many breads were there? Did you do one each or teamwork? Yeah. Okay, so 4 breads.
They were very competitive, weren't they? Particularly Sajid, who was a bit nasty at times, I thought. He chucked flour over me.
No. Yeah, in the middle of the working day.
I mean...
So we had to go back to the office, covered in white powder.
I felt like saying, don't you have a health service to run or something? But I thought that would be a bit cheeky. Right, let's go to our next caller. It's David in Enfield. Hello, David.
Good evening, everybody.
Hello.
Would the panel support the release of the Soubey report and the names of all politicians who have received Partygate FPNs to date before we vote on May the 5th?
Well, I think I have to come to you, Pippa Crerar, given that you broke most of the stories on all of this.
I was going to say yes, and then you mentioned May the 5th, and of course the police have decided that they're not going to give us any updates on the operation into lockdown parties at the heart of government before the elections. That's not to say they're not going to fine ministers or fine anybody that they regard as having transgressed the laws, but it's just we won't be told about it. This investigation has gone on, I think, a lot longer than a lot of us expected. It is continuing to go on. There's 12 different events that the government that took place on government turf, which the Met is investigating, 6 of which the Prime Minister was at himself. And apparently, Sue Gray handed over 300 photos and 500 documents as evidence. So they've got plenty to pour through. They've asked for questionnaires. In the spirit of transparency, obviously, I think it's important that elected politicians make clear and senior civil servants make clear when they're fined. We've been told by Number 10 that we'll be told the Prime Minister and Simon Case, the Cabinet Secretary, whenever they're fined, will be told, regardless of whether that's before or after the elections. I think that's the right thing. If, in the course of their work, the police end up fining other politicians, as they did with Rishi Sunak, the Treasury confirmed that, then I think, yes, of course, the onus should be on those individuals to feel that they should be honest about that and share that information with the public. I mean, that I think is the very minimum in terms of transparency that we require when you consider that we're not being told the names of anybody else or indeed which events they're being fined for.
Suzanne.
Yeah, it's an interesting one, isn't it? I think obviously the May elections are about local politics, so we're not talking about members of Parliament being re-elected here. So I can see perhaps, but so you might argue, well, why then is there the issue with the police? Why don't they just come out and tell us what we need to know? The argument's obviously that people, as they always do, and as a local councillor, this is something that particularly bugs me, most people don't vote in local elections on local policies.
Are you a local councillor?
I used to be,
right,
not anymore. I was 2010 to 2014 in London. People vote in local elections on national government issues, even though, of course, the two are very separate. And for me, as I say, as a former councillor, it's very often the local politics which are the most immediate and the more affect people at an everyday level, because that's what local councillors have got competency for. So I can see why the police have made that decision, although absolutely, we should absolutely see everything in that report, and I'm sure we will eventually. I think it's absolutely appalling that we have MPs in Parliament who are voting to throttle the British public, British businesses, with the most draconian restrictions, and yet went on to break them themselves. It's absolutely horrifies me.
Francis. Well, let's just remind ourselves of the question. Would the panel support a full disclosure to the public of the Sue Gray report and every MP who got a fixed penalty notice?
Full disclosure, absolutely. I've a little bit of sympathy for the concerns of the police, which are presumably about being seen to interfere in elections. But that kind of just makes me ask, come on, Conservative Party MPs, what are you waiting for? While our members, nurses, teachers, refuse collectors, were working through, putting their lives on the line in some cases, certainly their health, how hard was it for the Conservative Party and Prime Minister to figure out that if you're rigging up a karaoke, if you're wheeling in suitcases of booze, if you're dancing around your man bag to ABBA, that is not a work-related event. That is a party. And
we should make clear that Boris Johnson didn't go up to the local Tesco's and get the suitcase full of beer. That was at an event that he wasn't actually at, just to be fair.
OK, to be fair. I think there was...
Actually, he did pop into the Wine Time Fridays. It was on the route past. They were held every Friday.
Not at that one, I don't think.
Well, the suitcases full of booze were every Friday night. That's a long-standing Number 10 tradition that carried on during lockdown. That's a problem that happened during lockdown. And
so they did the suitcase every week?
Every Friday. They'd take the booze back to Number 10 and they'd have a wee gathering. And if you know the geography of Number 10, the press office and the room outside it, the Prime Minister has to walk past it from his office to go up to the flat. And I've had several people say to me, and we've written this in the paper, I've had several people say to me that the Prime Minister either turned a blind eye or in some cases actively encouraged people. Oh, you're letting off steam. Oh, great, you're letting off steam. And on occasion even joined them. So, he did know.
Well, I apologise, and I thought it was one event that happened.
And it comes back to that point. This is the guy who made the laws, who broke the laws, but the important thing is lied about it. Now, I just I think it actually looks bad on the Tory parliamentary party because, what are you waiting for? Everybody with any common sense in the public knows that's what's happened. It seems now that they're waiting for the results of the local elections before they move. Well, that just looks pretty cynical to me. You either think this is a matter of integrity and honesty and decency, or you don't. And if you do think, as I say, that he not only broke the law, he lied about it, then surely you have a responsibility to act because you're the only ones who can do anything about it.
Simon Heffer.
I think it's really craven of the police to suspend this. I mean, where do they draw the line? If somebody was guilty of rape or murder, would that wait until after the local elections? And okay, you can say, well, it's nothing like getting, as Johnson calls it, a speeding ticket for doing what he did. But there are so many millions of deeply aggrieved people in this country who made sacrifices, and you hear of what he was up to. And it was a culture in Number 10 that he did nothing to stop. And in fact, as you said, he encouraged it. And I want this out there tomorrow. I want the police to announce what they're doing tomorrow. I don't give a stuff about the elections next week, and they shouldn't either. This is about the rule of law. And I want the Sugray report there in glorious technicolor on a website called pathological-liar-dead-in-the-water.com that everybody is looking at, and I want him out. I mean, this is... I'm ashamed to live in a country, a supposedly civilised first world country, that has a head of government who is a pathological liar and has broken the law. And I don't think that I or any of my fellow Britons deserve that. I think it's appalling.
You talk to a lot of Tory politicians. I mean, how do they answer Francis's question? Well, why haven't they done it already?
Well, I do talk to a lot of Tory politicians, and I mean, some of them are organising quite heavily. You've had brave people like Steve Baker come out last week, and a number of others, David Davis, Andrew Mitchell, have come out in the past and said that he's got to go. I think a lot of them are waiting for next week to see what happens, hoping they'll wake up on Friday morning and see there's a miracle that the Conservatives have won endless councils from length and breadth of England. That's not going to happen.
But they're also not going to lose the number of seats that they're spinning that they will lose.
No, because they always spin that they're going to lose more than they actually do lose. But if I were an MP, and particularly a Red Wall MP, I'd look at those polls that show that the Red Wall vote was, 56% in the election. It's now down to about 37%. They're going to lose their seats. There's going to be a tidal wave of unemployed Conservative MPs at the next election. And what they've got to learn, and it's a very simple point, is that the brand has been sullied. But somebody who comes in with integrity, and there are men and women of integrity in the Conservative Party, somebody who comes in with integrity and honesty can turn this round. There's 2 years before an election. If they let him stay in power with his ruthless and systematic abuse of the rule of law and denigration of the rule of law, they are going to lose. And you talk about my conversations with Conservative MPs, what I've said to them is if you want to wake up on the morning after the next election and find that there's a Keir Starmer-Nicola Sturgeon coalition that's going to give the Scots a referendum on the union and end the union, that's the price of keeping Boris Johnson in power.
So we take Boris Johnson out and replace him with 2 other people that broke COVID law.
Well, do we? I mean,
who?
Well, Keir Starmer and Nicola Sturgeon.
Well, no, they didn't. And actually, Durham Police have said today that they've clarified they're not re-investigating. They decided that he didn't break COVID rules. Nicola Sturgeon did and was spoken to by police. But I do think that it's a false equivalence to say that walking into... Rare I defend a politician, eh? Walking into a barber's shop for 20 seconds and forgetting to put your mask on is the same as organising...
Why haven't they gone after Jeremy Corbyn? There's that famous photo of him hosting a dinner of, 6 or 10 people.
Wasn't he? I seem to recall he was fined.
Was he?
I believe so.
Take that back. That's 2 in a quarter there. I'm doing well on this programme, aren't I? I should remind you that next Thursday night from 10, Jackie Smith and I will be hosting LBC's local election night coverage live from this studio, so I hope you'll join us for that. And I hope you'll also phone in some more questions. 0345 6060 973. You're listening to Cross Question on LBC. Let's get the news headlines at 8:31 with Simon English.
Starting with some breaking news. Police investigating the disappearance of a mother of 2 in Lancashire have charged a man with her murder as they continue to search for her. 33-year-old Katie Kenyon went missing in Burnley on Friday and hasn't been seen since. A 50-year-old man is due in court tomorrow. The High Court has ruled the government broke the law by discharging untested hospital patients into care homes in England during the pandemic. Despite that, the former Health Secretary, Matt Hancock, says the ruling has cleared ministers of wrongdoing. Russia is threatening to cut off gas supplies to more EU countries after being hit with sanctions over its invasion of Ukraine. The Kremlin is stopping exports to Poland and Bulgaria because they're refusing to pay for it in rubles. LBC weather: chilly and mostly clear this evening, some cloud drifting into eastern England. A bright start for most tomorrow, but turning cloudy in the afternoon with a high of 17 degrees.
LBC. Cross Question with Iain Dale on LBC. Call 0345 6060 973.
8:34 on LBC. Let me reintroduce our panel for those of you who've just joined us. Simon Heffer is here from the Daily Telegraph. Pippa Crerar, and Sunday. Well, it's just the Telegraph now, isn't it?
It's the Telegraph.
Yeah. Pippa Crerar is political editor of the Daily Mirror. Suzanne Evans, political commentator, and Francis O'Grady, General Secretary of the TUC, but not for much longer.
You called me outgoing earlier, and I thought you meant extrovert.
I'm sure you have your moments, Francis. Now, why are you going?
You've done it. It's not till the end of the year.
You've done it for 10 years, but why now?
Because for myself, I've always believed that's the equivalent of 2 terms, and I think you need new blood, new energy. And I need a bloody good rest.
And a membership of the House of Lords, possibly. Wouldn't be surprised. Right, let's go to our next question. It is a text question from Caroline in Hackney. If it's true that these MPs really have been watching porn in the Commons, what should happen next? Francis.
Well, I can tell you what would happen in the real world of work. That this is gross misconduct. Number one, because when you're at work, you're meant to be working. And I think that applies to MPs as well. And number two, because there should be a culture of respect and decency, and that is evidently not the case if this MP has been caught watching porn.
We should say, I think it is just one MP, is it not?
It's one
not,
MP.
So we shouldn't...
That we know
the questioner said MPs, but just to be strictly accurate. Now, this is another one of your stories, Pippa.
It is. I mean, I was out and about last night and spoke to a Tory MP contact that had been in this room, in this meeting at the Commons last night. About 40 or 50 MPs were there. And it was a regular meeting. There wasn't sort of an agenda per se. But I guess in the context of the Angela Rayner row this week, sexism in Parliament was very much on people's minds. And one after another, up to about a dozen Tory women MPs stood up and shared their experiences of sexism and sexual harassment in the Commons. And they were talking to the guests at the meeting were the Chief Whip and the party chairman and the leader of the Commons. So, people that have potentially the capacity to do something about these things. And the comments sort of ranged from an MP saying, well, a colleague had been wearing a knee-length leather skirt with a slit up the front, and a Tory MP came up to her and said, oh, what's the day job? Suggesting that she had a different job by night. And, whips saying to groups of women going in to vote, come on, girls, get in and vote. That was sort of one end of the spectrum, if you like, and at the other end of the spectrum was much more, were other allegations, including this one that a Tory MP had sat down next to a woman minister in the chamber and then watched porn on his mobile phone. Now,
knowing that she could see it.
Well, presumably, but then presumably if you're the type of person, and this is not unique, I've got friends that have been, people sit next to them on buses and trains and stuff and watch porn. Presumably this is not just about the personal gratification somebody gets from watching the porn. They've got some sort of thing going on there with knowing voyeurism or whatever.
It's a power trip.
Well, it's a power trip. It's making people feel incredibly vulnerable and really sort of and uncomfortable. And clearly that's what this woman MP, this woman minister felt. My understanding is that she and one other colleague who'd also witnessed this, or witnessed the same politician, had spoken to the Chief Whip, who's now launched an investigation into this MP. And if they are found indeed to have watched porn in the Commons, then they're going to lose the whip. And the Prime Minister talked about this at PMQs. But of course, it's very difficult to get rid of a sitting MP. That's not actually in a party's gift, it's in the public's gift in terms of a recall petition or an election. You'd like to think that somebody that had breached the laws in such an outrageous, the rules in such an outrageous way would do the decent thing. And I don't even know, it's the Manor of Northwick or something is the term, isn't it? Basically stand down, but you've got to wonder whether they will.
The initial reports of this that I read said that the two female MPs had not named the MP to the Chief Whip. Now, is that still the case?
So it's our understanding that if the Chief Whip launched an investigation, then they can only have done that if they knew the identity of the individual. So I think the Chief Whip knows who it is.
Suzanne?
I cannot...
Has anything like that happened to you? I mean, not that, but sort of... I mean, I think a lot of women have got different sort of experiences in this area, ranging from, as Pippa said, from one end of the spectrum to the other.
Yeah, I mean, I've certainly experienced sexism. There's no doubt about that. But has anyone sat down next to me and started watching porn? No, thank goodness. I'd certainly have something to say about it if they did. I mean, Francis said, in the real world, they'd be out on their ear. In the workplace, this would not be tolerated. And I am absolutely struggling to get my head around how on earth somebody who thinks they have a role to play in public life, somebody that presumably goes into politics for the good of their country and the good of their local constituents, can behave in such an appalling way. I simply don't understand it. And Pippa, you mentioned personal gratification. Let's be honest here. You don't just sit down and watch porn on your mobile phone like you might watch an episode of EastEnders or something. You watch it because you want to get off on it, to put it bluntly. And so you've got that added element here as well, I think. You've got an overt sexual act as well as a passive watching, I think, happening in the House of Commons. And frankly, I hope we do find out who this is, because then public pressure can be put on this MP, and hopefully he will be out on his ear, because he damn well deserves to be.
Simon?
I don't disagree with any of that. Of course, we have a Prime Minister who set an interesting example in his treatment of women over the years. That's a matter of public record. And I suppose there are people in his parliamentary party who think that whatever they do in a degrading way towards women is perfectly acceptable. I often wonder, I mean, it's not so much about these people wanting to have a career in public life. I often think, well, don't they have, if they haven't got a wife or a daughter, do they have a mother or a sister? Do they ever think what effect this would have on a member of their family if somebody did this? I mean, if somebody sat on a train next to my wife doing this, I'd want to kill them. I think it's abominable. And you just wonder how stupid these people are, just how offensive, how badly brought up, how low they are. And how on earth do they become selected as a Conservative candidate, let alone get elected as a Conservative MP? I think whatever is thrown at them actually is probably not going to be enough.
But
will they resign? Of course they will. Nobody resigns these days.
Francis, we've got 56 MPs being investigated for some degree of sexual impropriety within the House of Commons. That's 9% of all MPs. And if you take women MPs out of it, I mean, I'm assuming they're all men. I don't know, but if they are all men, that's even higher.
But again, that's not untypical. The TUC did that big survey where and 90% of sexual harassment cases are about women being harassed by men.
I got into trouble earlier because I said that there are men who are harassed by women. It's happened to me on 3 different occasions, so I can't be the only one.
It does
but
happen.
90-95% the other way around.
Exactly. And that half of all women have experienced it. And, you know, the big challenge, I think, because I think a lot of women listening to not just that, but what happened to Angie Rayner, where it was a toxic mix, really, of sexism and snobbery, in my view. Real nasty snobbery. And I thought she handled it brilliantly and was so honest about when we do have these experiences, and I hear this all the time, particularly from younger women, you know, because it's so humiliating, there's part of you that's just trying to make light of it. You know, you don't actually want to be the person who's having to deal with it. It's hard. So the onus has to be on prevention. And in fact, the government did agree that they would introduce this new legal duty on employers to prevent sexual harassment at work, and we can work with employers in a very practical way to make that happen. But along with every other employment right that we were promised in an employment bill for the Queen's speech in May, it's on the never, never again. Nobody knows if or when it's ever going to happen.
But if we've got 9% of MPs being accused of this sort of behaviour, are we to take it that in most big workplaces up and down the country there's a similar proportion?
Oh, there certainly is. That's what our survey showed, that huge numbers of women, particularly young women, experience this. And the awful thing is again, particularly for young women, that rather than report it, they're likely to leave. And so they're actually losing their livelihoods and damaging their careers, because I think it's a power game, a lot of it. How much of it's to do with gratification? How much of it is to do with intimidating, humiliating and shoving women out of...
But Pippa, you've been covering politics either in Parliament or at City Hall over the last 20 years. Have you noticed a change in the behaviour of male MPs, or is there's still that sort of boys' club, isn't there? That oh, go on, I dare you to do that, she won't mind. That sort of larkery, if I can call it that, still goes on. It was very prevalent 20 years ago, possibly less so now, but we know about it more now because people are willing to speak up.
Well, we know about it now. There's the Commons Independent Complaints and Grievance System, which was set up cross-party 5 years ago. So people do actually make complaints.
It was Andrea Leadsom's initiative.
So people previously would probably, maybe complain to a colleague or a friend, but not necessarily, there wasn't sort of an obvious HR system. Officials or MP staff, their bosses were, the MPs who potentially were the ones that were responsible were also their HR line manager. So the system was very, very sort of poorly managed. But the biggest difference is that there are more women MPs and more women generally in politics, and because that sort of diluted the pool of people, if you like. It's meant that I think less of these, it is gradually getting better. But then also, I kind of feel that I'm not in a brilliant position to talk about it, because I've got lots of stories I could share with you from 15 years ago, 10 years ago, when I was a younger woman, of inappropriate behaviour and comments and touching and all sorts of things.
We're about to come to a break, so you can tell us
I'll save them afterwards. But it doesn't happen so much now because I'm more senior and I'm
Francis
older.
will probably all have stories like that, I'm guessing.
Well, on that bombshell, you don't, Simon. What a relief. We will go to a break. More questions in a moment. 0345 6060 973. It's 8:45.
LBC. Nick Ferrari at breakfast.
If you're working from home today and you're in the passport office, where presumably there's enormous danger of data being passed, get into the office. It is that simple. We've got millions of people waiting for passports. Certainly, I would imagine hundreds, if not thousands, of people inconvenienced because they haven't got their passports. And you're working from home. It's a disgrace. If you're not in by 12 o'clock noon, don't bother coming back. Otherwise, honestly, stay at home, sit in the back garden, enjoy your summer.
Nick Ferrari at breakfast. Back tomorrow morning from 7. Listen on your radio and on Global Player. LBC. New. Cross Question with Iain Dale on LBC.
8:49, Simon Heffer, Pippa Crerar, Suzanne Evans and Francis O'Grady with me answering your questions. Let's go to Chris in Croydon. Hello, Chris.
Good evening, Ian. Good evening, panel.
Hi.
My question is this. Should sanctions against Russia continue as long as Putin rules?
Suzanne Evans.
I think if Putin were to withdraw all his troops from Ukraine, then I think a view would have to be taken to backtrack on some of the sanctions that are put in place. If he's a good boy and behaves, then I think we have to think again. But until that point, no, absolutely not.
So you would withdraw some sanctions even if he continued to be the president of Russia?
Yes, I would, because ultimately sanctions are going to hurt the Russian people, and my beef is not with the Russian people, it's with the Russian leader.
Pippa.
I think I certainly agree with Suzanne that as long as he's in Ukraine, then sanctions should apply. I think it depends on his behaviour should they withdraw. And I have to say, frankly, I don't see any sign of that happening anytime soon. But should he withdraw and still be an aggressor and a troublemaker and launch cyber attacks on Britain and other countries, then they should stay in place. If suddenly there's a Damascus conversion and he wants to be a sort of an accepted member of the international community, then maybe you do look at what you can do to make that happen. But I just can't see it happening.
Simon?
I think sanctions must continue until he's either in the dock at The Hague or has a bullet in the back of his head.
Trenchant as ever. Francis?
I'd like to see sanctions toughened against the oligarchs in particular. There's still plenty of scope to toughen those sanctions against Russia as long as they're carrying on a war which is clearly illegal, in breach of international law and causing horror and misery. I think, and this may be hard to imagine, but I think President Zelensky himself said any war ends in negotiation, and that we have to think, however far ahead this is, about support to reconstruct the country, to immediate support, humanitarian support, massive displacement within the country, but also how we build those stepping stones towards eventual peace.
But is it inevitable that in any negotiation to end the war that Russia will have gained something from it? Because surely that defeats the whole objective of Ukraine fighting this war.
I think part of the objective of our solidarity is that it's the Ukrainian people who will decide, and our job is to support them.
Because Rachel Johnson, who presents the show on Sunday evenings on this station, a couple of weeks ago, she said that, well, of course, that this war will end, and it will end with some sort of partition of Ukraine. Now, people got very, very angry that she'd said that, but if you think about it, that is a very possible outcome, isn't it, Pippa?
I mean, you consider the fact that Crimea was invaded in 2014 and has been in Russian hands ever since. You consider that the actions subsequently in Donbass and eastern Ukraine, the Russians are obviously, occupying there as well. Zelensky has said he wants to keep Ukraine intact. I think if you look at, it's very difficult to say comparable conflicts because there's been very few that are just like this. But if you look at other conflicts where countries have been ostensibly divided up, you don't suddenly get the sort of the home nation saying that's fine, you can have this bit of the country. I find it very hard to envisage a time when Zelensky's compromises include conceding large tracts of land, large parts of Ukraine, because his fear is that that's not the end of it, that if you concede those bits of the Ukraine, Russia will be back for more.
Yes, and it's not just the end of it in Ukraine, it's also not the end of it for places like Estonia and Latvia and Lithuania.
Moldova.
Well, we've already heard about him going into Transnistria and Moldova, but those other three countries I just named are in the European Union and they're in NATO. And we know that he wants a land bridge to Kaliningrad, which must either go through Lithuania or through Poland, probably through Lithuania. And he regards the Baltic states as being part of Russia. And they were, for hundreds of years, part of Russia until 1918. So it's not just a question. I understand why Zelensky says it must end in negotiation. He's a great leader and he's done everything he possibly can for his own people. But even he will have to understand at some stage this goes beyond Ukraine. It goes beyond ensuring that we don't have Russia marauding into the Baltic states. And that, I think, is something that Putin will be minded to do if he's given even half a chance to do so.
Quick question. Liz Truss, the Foreign Secretary, is giving a big foreign policy speech tonight, and she's going to suggest that we, Britain, send tanks and planes to Ukraine. Now, we're going to be talking about this in the next hour on the programme, so gird your loins. I want phone calls on that. But given James Heapy's comments yesterday about saying it's perfectly right for Ukraine to attack targets inside Russia, do you think that these comments from Heapy and Liz Truss are wise, Francis?
Well, from my perspective, this is about the impact of war on ordinary people. And, one of the reasons why in the trade union movement we always see war as a last resort, we're not pacifists, but we see it as a last resort, and peace as the prize, is because the main casualties are always civilians and children. So
you sound like a politician. I'm not answering the question.
I guess my point is that hard as it is in the midst of this horror, where in other parts of the world where civic society has had a role in peace building too, there also has to be some imagining of what it will take to secure peace and stability for the country and for the region. And that is none of this is easy, but that is part of our task,
Simon?
is to support that.
I think we can. I'd like to send them planes and tanks and missiles and God knows what else, but we can only do this in a coordinated way with our NATO allies. Mm-hmm. We can't be the only country that does this, otherwise we're a sitting target.
Absolutely. Yeah, totally agree. That is one way of massively escalating this crisis and putting Britain in the firing line. And I'm a great fan of Liz Truss, but I think she's wrong on this one.
Well, I wonder whether Number 10 also thinks she's wrong on this, because their response anyway at the moment is that there's no plans to either to provide planes.
But for a foreign secretary to say that in her biggest speech of the year, or one of them, I mean, surely they have to clear these speeches with Number 10.
You'd think so, but Number 10 is saying that there aren't currently any plans to backfill either providing jets and so on to Poland and then the Poles, for example.
Well, it's some kite.
It's Liz making a leadership bid.
Come on, kite to fly, isn't it?
The other problem,
That's what it's all about.
Well, indeed. Chris, thank you very much for that. Let's do a quick question before we finish with Ram in Windsor. Good evening, Ram. What's your question, please?
Yes, good evening, panel. Would the members of the panel feel safe if I was driving behind their vehicle without an annual MOT?
What car do you drive, Ram?
I actually drive a Bentley.
We have a different class of listener.
How old is it?
How old is it, Ram?
It's about 8 years old, but my number plate's T1. It's more
You must be very rich to have a number plate like that. Right, Pippa.
Well, I think the AA, and they're the experts, have said that they don't think it's a good idea to bring MOTs back to, or to take MOTs every other year rather than every year. This is, of course, one of the cost of living, money-saving ideas that the Cabinet dreamt up yesterday. Non-fiscal interventions, they're called. It actually would only save people £27 a year, but in terms of the safety element of it, if the AA says it's a bad idea, and let's not forget this is a policy that was considered 15 years ago and then rejected 15 years ago as well, then I think I'd probably go with the AA on that one.
Simon Heffer, I imagine you drive a sort of Bobby Ewing style Mercedes.
Mrs. Heffer does.
Oh, right.
Mrs. Heffer's got a Mercedes. I'm rarely allowed on the roads. I think it's...
By the speeding authorities.
Right. I think it's mad. I mean, it's £27 a year. And, living in Essex as I do, I see boy racers going around with all sorts of things falling off their cars, and you give them a very wide berth indeed. I wouldn't want to have to give them an even wider one. I don't think you can compromise public safety. I think there are slightly better ways of giving people £27 a year, like a tax cut.
Yeah, I'd agree with that. To be honest, I think modern cars are so much better than they were. I'm personally not convinced that the annual MOT is necessary anymore. And I think this is fiddling while Rome burns. £27 saved. Come on. Chancellor, you've had a £175 billion tax bonus this year. We're now paying 30% of GDP in taxes instead of 27% last year. Give us a tax cut instead. This is nonsense.
And what about the poor garages that rely on MOTs?
Is this the best that the Cabinet could come
clearly.
up with, really? I mean, here's a novel idea. If you really want to help people in a living standards emergency crisis, then how about raising the national minimum wage to at least £10 an hour? How about giving nurses and teachers a real pay rise? How about having fair pay agreements? And how about Iain joining us on Saturday, the 18th
Oh, not
of June,
you as well.
for our national
Not you
demonstration?
As well. I had this from Dave. Well, I've got to go to a wedding.
David Beckham, bring him along.
Yeah, oh, you heard that, did you? No, actually, it's not a wedding; it's a birthday party.
But this is David Beckham.
But the thing is, no, the events are happening at his place.
Your invite is withdrawn. You're free now.
I don't know what to say. Right, it says on my screen, controversial final text from Karen in Leeds. So-called social mobility chief Catherine Birbalsingh says girls don't take physics at A-level as they apparently dislike hard maths. What subjects did you do at school, and did being female change your mind, Simon Heffer?
I was lousy at science. I couldn't
Me
wait.
too.
I couldn't wait to do sort of Latin and Greek and things like that. I was hopeless at science. So I did history and languages and English, stuff like that.
I think any girl that says they dislike physics is quite absolutely understandable. I got ungraded in my physics O-level, which I'm kind of rather proud of. Francis?
Oh, I loved reading. That's what I did all the time.
What were you bad at?
Oh, what was I bad at? Oh, a lot of things, including a period of not going to school.
Oh, no, we want to hear more about this.
But I loved learning. just not always.
Okay. Well, on the basis of what you've just said there, you now get an invitation to do my hour-long All Talk podcast, where we will explore your school years in far more detail. Suzanne Evans.
Well, I'm afraid I was not very good at science either. I was definitely in favour of the arts. However, in mitigation, I will say I now have a wonderful 29-year-old daughter who did a degree in biomedical sciences and got a first, and is now studying for a PhD in skeletal biology. Fantastic.
That's just showing off.
I've made
That
it
is very
Pippa?
impressive. Well, I had the benefit of going to school in Scotland, and the system at the time meant that you could take lots of subjects. You didn't need to specialise until very late. So I was able to do maths, chemistry, physics, biology, and art, French, history, and English. So I was able to do them all.
What were you bad at?
What was I bad at? Pretty bad at sport, if I'm completely honest. Really? But but my little girl, you ask her what her favourite subject is maths. She's chosen to go to maths club after school.
Oh my goodness.
I love that. It's brilliant. I'm going to encourage it. Yes.
Strange child. Pippa, thank you very much. Suzanne, Francis and Simon will have you back very, very soon. Coming up in the next hour, we are going to talk about that speech by Liz Truss where she suggests that Britain should be supplying planes to Ukraine. Now, given the phone-in we did last night about James Heapy's comments, I'm really interested to hear what you say about this. And by the way, if you're a Russian apologist, don't bother phoning in. It's 9:01.
On your radio, on Global Player, and
Play LBC.
leading Britain's conversation. This is LBC.
From Global's newsroom. Police investigating the disappearance of a mother of two in Lancashire have charged a man with her murder as they